The last thing I expected on my first morning of vacation was to be accused of eco-terrorism by a woman holding a chihuahua in one arm and a clipboard in the other. She stormed up my gravel driveway in leopard print Crocs, eyes blazing like I had personally offended the spirit of the mountain. What was my crime? A hummingbird feeder. One I hadn't even hung yet. She pointed a shaky finger at the tree beside my cabin and screamed, "You're baiting invasive species." I thought it was a joke. 10 minutes later, 3 cop cars rolled up the hill and boxed in my truck like I was a cartel fugitive. And that's when I pulled out the deed. Not just to my cabin. To the entire Mountain Hermic mansion was illegally sitting on. 3 days earlier, I had finally taken a break from the non-stop grind of urban life. The cabin was my late uncle's, passed down after he died last year. Nestled deep in the Blue Ridge, it was my sanctuary away from emails, deadlines, and exhaust fumes. The road up was barely a road, more like a twisting thread of gravel with weeds fighting to take it back. That first night, I sat on the porch with a coffee and watched the stars ignite the sky. Silence so pure it rang in my ears. Peaceful didn't even begin to cover it. The next morning, I was filling up the bird feeder when I heard footsteps crunching up the path. I figured it might be a friendly neighbor coming to say hello. Instead, a woman in a pink windbreaker stomped into view like she owned the forest. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't smile. She just raised her clipboard like it was a badge and said, "Do you realize you're in violation of Community Code Section 4B? I blinked. I hadn't spoken a word, and already I was apparently a criminal. I asked her, politely at first, what code she was talking about. She said it was a violation of the Mountain View HOA's Environmental Integrity Guidelines. That sounded impressive until I realized she was citing rules from an HOA I'd never heard of, and I definitely hadn't joined. I told her this was private land, that my uncle had owned the property for decades, and I was just here for a week or two to unwind. She narrowed her eyes and said, "That feeder attracts hummingbirds. Hummingbirds attract predators. Predators endanger our pets." Then she looked down at the chihuahua and whispered, "Don't worry, Muffin. He won't hurt you." I laughed. I couldn't help it. It just burst out of me. That was the moment she started dialing. I thought she was bluffing until I heard her say the words, "Yes, I'd like to report a non-compliant structure and environmental hazard. He's threatening the ecosystem." She gave my address. How she even knew it, I had no idea, and told the dispatcher that I was being hostile. I was still holding a plastic feeder and a bag of sugar when she said it. Muffin barked once, like a warning shot. I figured the cops would take one look at the situation and drive away laughing. But when 3 cruisers pulled up 30 minutes later and surrounded the cabin, I started to wonder if Karen had connections. The first officer out looked serious. He stepped forward and asked me if I had identification and if I was the legal owner of the property. I stayed calm, opened the lockbox in the truck, and pulled out a folded set of documents my uncle had told me to always keep close. I handed it over without a word. He scanned the deed. Then he scanned it again. His eyebrows slowly rose and he gave me a long, confused look. "Sir," he said, "this says you own over 200 acres. This whole ridge." I nodded. Karen, standing behind him with her arms crossed and that smug little dog under one elbow, turned pale. The cop asked if I knew there were properties built along the edge of my land. I said I did, and that I had been planning to survey the boundary lines this summer. Karen took a step back like she'd been hit. She tried to protest, saying I had forged the deed, but the second officer, who had been quietly calling dispatch, interrupted her. "Ma'am," he said, "this was registered 15 years ago. The county recorder confirms it. This is legitimate." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a trout gasping for air. I thought Muffin might actually faint. After the police left, I sat on the porch again, but the peace wasn't the same. I kept thinking about that clipboard. About how someone could walk up to a stranger and try to enforce imaginary rules just because they'd printed a letterhead and bullied their neighbors into submission. It wasn't about birds or pets or community safety. It was about control. She'd seen a man in a flannel shirt with dirt on his boots, and decided I didn't belong. That night, I walked the property lines and noticed something strange. Fence posts were moved. Survey markers disturbed. I found a freshly hammered sign halfway down the hill that read, "Private HOA property, no trespassing." It was on my land. That's when I realized Karen wasn't just delusional. She was staging something, laying groundwork for a land grab or pushing a power play with the neighbors. I decided not to take it lying down. The next morning, I drove into town and bought 2 trail cameras, a stack of private property, surveillance in use signs, and a drone. If she wanted a war, I wasn't going to fight it with words and fake rules. I'd fight it with evidence. As I unpacked the gear back at the cabin, a shadow moved across the window. I looked up to see Karen, again, standing just beyond the driveway with a new flyer in hand. She didn't walk up this time. She taped the paper to a tree and left. I walked over and read it. HOA notice. Unauthorized structure under investigation. Potential fines pending. Compliance required immediately. The paper had her name and a fake seal. And just like that, the battle for the mountain had begun. For 2 days after the police confirmed I owned the entire mountain, Karen disappeared. Not a peep. No dogs barking, no flyers stapled to trees, no new imaginary citations duct-taped to my cabin door. It was almost too quiet. I should have felt relieved, maybe even triumphant, but instead I felt a strange sort of tension hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. I kept telling myself she had finally realized she picked the wrong fight. Maybe she was embarrassed. Maybe she had gone back down the mountain to spin the story to her HOA drones. Either way, I knew better than to let my guard down. Karen didn't strike me as the type to go quietly. The quiet snapped on the 3rd morning. I took my coffee outside and spotted a group of people gathered in a semicircle on Karen's patio. She stood in front of them with her arms folded, speaking in sharp, clipped gestures like she was giving a wartime briefing. I counted 7 heads. Some were nodding, others crossing their arms with that same defensive stance she always had. Even from a distance, I could tell the atmosphere was sour. She was riling them up, and I had a hunch I was the subject of her sermon. I slipped back inside and grabbed my binoculars. They were a gift from my uncle, and I never thought I'd be using them to spy on an HOA meeting disguised as a backyard tea party. I scanned the group carefully. One couple looked like they didn't want to be there. A man in a fishing hat kept checking his watch. But a few others leaned forward like they were truly buying whatever Karen was selling. I couldn't hear what she said, but her body language was clear. She pointed toward my cabin at least 5 times. She shook her head dramatically. One woman even gasped. Karen held up a piece of paper and waved it like it was a sacred scroll. My gut said it was some kind of fake report. Later that afternoon, I went for a walk along one of the outer trails and noticed something new. Pinned to a tree with a thumbtack was another HOA flyer. This one was even more ridiculous than the first. It read, "Notice of violation, improper waste management." Beneath that, it accused me of disposing hazardous materials and damaging the soil. I looked around. The only thing in sight was a compost bin and a few fallen leaves. No oil drums, no paint cans, no evidence of anything. It was fiction. But it was carefully crafted fiction. That worried me more than if she had just stuck with screaming about bird feeders. I followed the trail deeper, and the deeper I went, the more flyers I found. They were spread like breadcrumbs, each one accusing me of something different. Unpainted cabin. Unregulated wildlife feeding. Unauthorized solar panels. Illegal excavation. The last one made me laugh. My tools were still in storage, and the only hole I had dug was for a fire pit barely 2 feet deep. Karen was creating a record, a paper trail of invented crimes. But I could tell she wasn't doing it for me. She was building a case for her audience, her neighbors, the ones she needed to side with her if she wanted to regain control. When I got back to the cabin, I went straight to my trail cams. I had positioned 2 near the front edge of the property and another one at the trail entrance. Sure enough, the memory card had new footage. Around midnight, Karen had wandered onto my land with a flashlight and a roll of tape. She paused at each tree, stuck a flyer to it, and then checked the camera lens. She didn't notice the second hidden cam behind her catching everything from a better angle. I had full-color video of her trespassing, placing fraudulent notices, and inspecting the land like it belonged to her. I backed it up immediately. That night, I typed up a cease and desist letter. It wasn't dramatic. It was calm, professional, and backed by law. I cited the property boundary, the documentation from the county office, and included a short line about pending legal consequences if her harassment continued. Then I walked it over to her house in the morning and handed it to her myself. She opened the door wearing a robe, a towel on her head, and sunglasses like she was trying to hide from the truth. I didn't say anything. I just offered the letter, nodded once, and walked away. I hadn't made it halfway down her gravel path before she shouted after me. Her voice was shrill, like a kettle about to boil over. She accused me of threatening her, of trying to intimidate a peaceful community leader. I kept walking. She yelled that she had rights, that the HOA would not be bullied by an outsider with deep pockets and no manners. Then she added, "Your bird feeder is still out of compliance." Hours later, a sheriff's cruiser rolled up again. I wasn't surprised this time. The officer stepped out, the same one as before, and walked up to me slowly. I greeted him, offered a bottle of water, and calmly explained everything that had happened since their last visit. He listened carefully, took down the information, and then I showed him the footage. He watched the video in silence. Karen sneaking around with her flashlight. Karen slapping flyers to trees. Karen checking for cameras like a raccoon in a security vest. He chuckled once and nodded. He told me that while no arrest would be made yet, this was a clear case of harassment and possibly criminal trespass if it continued. He said they'd have a word with her and that I should consider posting formal no trespassing signs if I hadn't already. I thanked him, handed over a USB copy of the footage, and watched as he drove up toward her place. The next part one didn't expect. 15 minutes after the cruiser vanished over the hill, I heard shouting. Then more voices. I walked up the trail quietly and saw a small crowd had gathered near Karen's driveway. She was red-faced, gesturing wildly, and trying to explain something while the officer stood calmly, arms folded, not saying much. A few neighbors were whispering. One older man pointed toward my cabin, nodded, then shook his head. Karen looked around and realized the mood had shifted. She wasn't the fearless leader anymore. She was just a loud neighbor being talked to by the law. I backed away before anyone saw me. I didn't need applause or a victory lap. I just wanted my peace. But something told me that this was only her opening act. Karen wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The morning after the sheriff spoke to Karen, I woke up to find a new sign nailed to the front of my gate. It wasn't the usual printed HOA nonsense. This one was handmade, scrawled in thick red marker on a piece of plywood that looked like it had been torn from the side of a shed. It read, "Community Watch Zone. Violators will be photographed and prosecuted." Underneath, in smaller, shakier writing, someone had added, "Report suspicious mountain men." I stared at it for a full minute, more amused than angry. It was desperate and childish, the kind of thing someone does when their fake authority starts crumbling under the weight of real consequences. But even childish moves can be dangerous when they come from someone with no boundaries. I took the sign down and decided it was time to set a trap. Not a literal trap, although I was tempted. I upgraded the trail cams with motion alerts tied to my phone and repositioned one to face the narrow path that cut between my property and the back of Karen's house. That path wasn't on any map, but the ground was clearly worn from years of sneaky use. It was a backdoor she thought I wouldn't find. I found it and aimed the lens right at it. Then I set up a dummy toolbox and some bright pink survey flags nearby, just to bait her in. That night, right around midnight, my phone buzzed. Motion detected.